It begins with a sound, the deafening roar of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the sound of Britain's defiance. Then, in the most critical moment of a dogfight, that roar vanishes. For just over 1 second, there is only a terrifying silence. In that silence, a British pilot is helpless, and an enemy fighter closes in. This is the story of that deadly silence, and of the one woman who dared to break it. Stay with us, and you will learn how a secret, no bigger than a coin, saved the pilots of the Royal Air Force and changed the course of the war in the air. In the cold morning air of March 14, 1941, Beatrice Schilling watched a young man climb into his Hawker Hurricane. He was just 24 years old, but his eyes held the weight of 41 combat missions. He was a veteran, an ace. He was also a man flying a machine with a fatal secret. For weeks, a pattern had emerged in the skies over the English Channel, a pattern written in smoke and wreckage. British pilots would spot a German fighter, push the nose of their Hurricane or Spitfire down into a dive, and their engine would die. The powerful Merlin engine, the heart of Britain's defense, had an Achilles heel. During a sudden dive, a maneuver pilots called a -G, fuel would surge the wrong way inside the carburetor. For 1.5 agonizing seconds, the engine was starved of fuel. It was just enough time for a German Messerschmitt to escape, or worse, to turn back and fire into the stalled British plane while its pilot fought desperately to get the engine roaring again. The Germans didn't have this problem. Their engines used a more advanced direct fuel injection system. They could dive, climb, and roll without ever missing a beat. They knew about the British weakness, and they exploited it without mercy, luring RAF pilots into dives that would become traps. Experienced men, the very backbone of fighter command, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. How many good men fell from the sky, not because of an enemy's skill, but because of a flaw in their own machine? Beatrice Schilling stood on that tarmac, a 32-year-old engineer in a world of uniformed men. To the pilots walking by, she likely looked like a secretary, or perhaps someone's wife visiting the base. They didn't know she was the principal technical officer from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the nation's top mind on carburetors. They didn't know she had spent nearly a year living with this problem, reading the combat reports, interviewing the shaken survivors, and feeling the weight of every loss. The official solution was years away. The engineers at Rolls-Royce were designing a brand new pressure carburetor, a complete and total redesign. It was the proper engineering answer, but it wouldn't be ready until 1943 at the earliest. The war wouldn't wait. The pilots couldn't wait. The young men climbing into their cockpits that morning couldn't wait. A perfect solution tomorrow is useless to the person who needs a good solution today. What must it have felt like for her, knowing the right answer was too slow to save the men she saw right in front of her? But Beatrice hadn't come to the airbase that morning just to observe. She had brought something with her, tucked away in the leather satchel of her Norton motorcycle. It was a small, simple piece of brass. To the untrained eye, it looked like little more than a washer. It was a device born not in a corporate boardroom, but in the mind of a single engineer who was tired of waiting. It was her answer, and it was completely, dangerously unauthorized. This little piece of metal was the result of months of secret work. While official committees debated, Schilling had been at her workbench. She understood that when the plane dived, fuel flooded the chamber because nothing was holding it back. Her solution was brilliantly simple. What if you just restricted the flow? A brass disc with a precisely drilled hole in the center would act like a dam, preventing the flood but still letting enough fuel through. She had even machined the first prototypes herself, shaped like a tiny thimble. This wasn't just bending the rules. To install an uncertified part onto a frontline fighter was a violation of dozens of military regulations. If her device failed, if a pilot's engine cut out and he never came home, the consequences for her would be severe. A court-martial was a certainty. She could face prison. There was no paper trail, no signed orders, no one to share the blame. The decision and the risk was hers alone. What kind of person, what kind of conviction does it take to bet your entire future on a piece of brass that could fit on your fingertip? The records of the time are clinical, speaking of engine performance and fuel flow rates. But the reality was far more personal. The true, unwritten cost of the carburetor problem is a question that still haunts historians. We know 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires went down in a single week. But how many of those losses were directly attributable to the engine stall? The chaos of a dogfight made it impossible to know for sure. A pilot fighting a dead engine was an easy target. Was his loss recorded as engine failure or shot down by enemy aircraft? This statistical gray area means we may never know the full extent of the crisis Beatrice Schilling was trying to solve. She wasn't just fixing an engine. She was fighting an invisible enemy that was decimating her own side from within. That morning on the tarmac, with the fate of a pilot hanging on her secret, Beatrice Schilling was calm. Her confidence wasn't born in a lecture hall or a sterile laboratory. It was forged in grease, gasoline, and speed. To understand why she was willing to risk everything, you have to understand where she came from. She wasn't just an engineer who read textbooks. She was a woman who had tamed engines with her own 2 hands, learning their language not through equations, but through sound, vibration, and feel. From a young age, Beatrice, or Tilly as her friends called her, was drawn to the mechanical world. At just 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a used Norton. For most teenagers, this would have been a simple thrill, a taste of freedom. For Tilly, it was an education. She didn't just ride it, she dismantled it. Imagine a young girl, in an age where such things were unheard of, laying every gear, piston, and valve out on the garage floor. She learned the purpose of every single component, not because a teacher told her to, but because of a deep, driving need to understand. Then she rebuilt it, better than before. Her hands learned the language of machines long before her mind learned the formal theories of engineering. This was more than a hobby. It was a passion that bordered on obsession. By the time she was in her 20s, she wasn't just riding her Norton, she was racing it. She took it to Brooklands, a fearsome banked motor racing circuit known for its punishing speeds and bumpy, unforgiving concrete surface. Brooklands wasn't a pristine, modern track. It was a brutal test of nerve and mechanical endurance. Here, she competed against the best male riders in the country. She wasn't a novelty act, she was a contender. With her chin tucked down and her hand steady on the throttle, she pushed her motorcycle to its absolute limit, averaging an astonishing 106 miles per hour. This incredible feat earned her the prestigious Gold Star from the British Motorcycle Racing Club, an award so revered that only 3 women in history had ever received it. She was the second. What does motorcycle racing have to do with saving fighter pilots? Everything. Racing taught her something that could never be learned from a blueprint: intuition. She learned to feel an engine's stress through the handlebars, to understand its needs before the gauges could even register a problem. She knew the precise moment an engine would falter in a high G turn, the subtle vibration that signaled fuel starvation under extreme acceleration. She had lived, at over 100 miles per hour, in the same world of physics that was now claiming the lives of RAF pilots. This hands-on, visceral knowledge gave her a perspective that her male colleagues, for all their academic brilliance, simply did not possess. They were like doctors who had only ever read medical textbooks. She was the surgeon who had spent years in the operating room. When she joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1939, she was a true outsider. As one of only 2 women in the entire engine department, the other being a secretary, she faced a wall of skepticism. Many of the men she worked with, educated in the formal, theoretical traditions of Cambridge and Oxford, had never encountered a female engineer. Some privately questioned what a motorcycle girl could possibly contribute to the complex science of aeronautics. But Tilly Schilling didn't care what they believed. She had earned her place not through conformity, but through sheer talent and a lifetime of getting her hands dirty. She cared about one thing: solving the problem and keeping pilots alive. Her colleagues at Rolls-Royce saw the carburetor issue as a complex fluid dynamics puzzle, one requiring a total redesign, an answer that was elegant on paper but years away in practice. They were thinking like academics, but Tilly was thinking like a racer. She saw the violent dive of a Spitfire not as a new problem, but as an old one turned upside down. On the banked oval of Brooklands, a rider experiences powerful sideways G-forces that try to slosh fuel away from the engine's intake. She had felt that momentary hesitation, that near stall 100 times. Her solution, the simple brass restrictor, wasn't a compromise. It was an elegant, targeted fix born from that lived experience. It was the kind of direct, no-nonsense solution a mechanic would devise, not a committee. This brings us to a curious, almost fringe detail about her method. Her genius was not just in the what, but in the how. While other engineers relied on slide rules and calculation, Tilly relied on a combination of math and mechanical empathy. She could visualize the fuel sloshing, feel the pressure change, and hear the engine's protest in her mind's ear. This intuitive, almost artistic approach to a deeply technical problem was her secret weapon. It allowed her to see the simple truth hiding behind a wall of complex physics. And so we are left with a question that history can't fully answer. How much of her breakthrough came from her formal engineering degree, and how much came from that intuitive feel she developed over thousands of miles on her Norton? Was it the formulas that led her to the solution, or was it the muscle memory of a racer's hand on a throttle, correcting a problem before it became a disaster? That racer's instinct was a variable that could never be measured or written down in a report, but it may have been the most important tool she possessed as she prepared to make the biggest gamble of her life. Her certainty, born on the racetrack and refined in the laboratory, now faced its ultimate test. Proving her theory wouldn't happen in a sterile testing bay. It had to happen in the sky, during combat, with a man's life on the line. And she had to make it happen without anyone in authority knowing. That morning at RAF Kenley, with 6 of her brass restrictors in her satchel, she wasn't looking for an officer or a commander. She was looking for someone who understood engines not as symbols of power, but as collections of metal and fuel that could either bring a pilot home or fail him catastrophically. She found that person in Sergeant William Cooper. Sergeant Cooper was a ground crew chief who had worked on Merlin engines for 3 long years. He was not an engineer, but he was an expert. He had seen 19 pilots from his station die due to engine failures. He had written letters to their families. He had seen the frustration in the eyes of the survivors. When this determined woman in civilian clothes showed him a small brass washer and explained, quietly and clearly, what it was designed to do, he didn't ask to see her authorization papers. He didn't quote regulations. He saw a chance, however slim, to stop the dying. He simply nodded and reached for his toolkit. Their conspiracy unfolded in a matter of minutes, right there on the dispersal pad. The Hurricane sat waiting, its engine already warming up. The pilot, Squadron Leader Davies, was running through his pre-flight checks, completely unaware of the drama taking place just outside his cockpit. Cooper worked with a speed that spoke of deep familiarity. He disconnected a fuel line. The small brass restrictor, Tilly's invention, slid perfectly into place. A quick, precise weld with a small torch, and the line was reconnected. The entire modification took less than 60 seconds. When it was done, it was invisible. There was no sign of tampering. Nothing to suggest that this particular Hurricane was any different from the hundreds of others in the RAF. Nothing, except for a secret held between an engineer and a sergeant. Imagine the weight of that moment. Schilling checked the weld. It was clean, solid. She had placed her career, her freedom, and another person's life into the hands of Sergeant Cooper, a man she barely knew but whose quiet competence she trusted implicitly. And what about him? This is where the official history goes silent. We know what Tilly risked, but what about the sergeant? As a non-commissioned officer, he was bound by a strict chain of command. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, a court-martial would have likely treated him far more harshly than the civilian engineer from Farnborough. Did he hesitate? Did he weigh his duty to the regulations against his duty to his pilots? His actions speak for themselves. He chose the pilots. The Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies released the brakes, and the Hurricane rolled forward, gathering speed before lifting gracefully into the sky. Schilling watched it climb, a pair of binoculars pressed to her eyes. She followed it until it was just a speck, joining two other Hurricanes as they banked south toward the channel. She had done all she could. Now there was only the waiting. The minutes on the tarmac stretched into an eternity. The normal sounds of a fighter station at war, the rumble of fuel trucks, the shouts of mechanics, seemed distant and muffled. Schilling stood beside Cooper, neither of them speaking a word. She found herself mentally rehearsing the calculations, the fuel flow rates, the fluid dynamics. The math was sound. Her bench tests had been successful. But combat wasn't a laboratory. Combat was chaotic, violent, and unpredictable. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. Radio silence from the patrol could mean anything. It could mean they hadn't encountered the enemy. Or it could mean the fighting was so intense there was no time to talk. Or it could mean the worst had happened. Then, a crackle from the control tower radio. A calm voice announced 3 Hurricanes inbound. Schilling raised her binoculars, her hands shaking slightly. 3 dark shapes resolved against the clouds. Not 2. All 3 were coming home. Squadron Leader Davies landed first, taxiing his Hurricane to its designated spot. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was as loud as the previous roar. As he climbed out of the cockpit, pulling off his helmet, Schilling saw something she didn't expect. He was smiling. Pilots didn't usually smile after a patrol. They looked tired, drained, haunted. But Davies looked energized, triumphant. Sergeant Cooper, ever the professional, asked the question that hung in the air. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked from the sergeant to the quiet woman standing beside him, and then back again. "Problems?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "That's the best the Merlin has ever run. Dove on 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness. The engine never missed a beat." He explained how he had pushed the plane into a steep 400-mile-per-hour dive, the very maneuver that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin had screamed with full power the entire way down. For the first time, he had been able to press an attack without his own aircraft betraying him. He had fired a burst and seen it strike the enemy plane. He wanted to know what on earth the ground crew had done. And so, Schilling told him. She explained the restrictor, the simple physics behind the brass washer. Davies listened, his expression changing from confusion to awe. He stared at her for a long moment, processing the audacity of it. Then he turned to Cooper. "Put that thing," he commanded, "in every Hurricane on this station. Today." When Schilling gently reminded him that the modification wasn't authorized, Davies waved her off. He didn't care about regulations written by men in comfortable offices hundreds of miles away. He cared about surviving. The gamble had paid off. The secret was out, and the demand for Miss Schilling's simple brass washer was about to become a flood. Squadron Leader Davies's order to put that thing in every Hurricane was not a suggestion. It was a cry of relief from a man who had stared into the face of a fatal design flaw and survived. Authorization didn't matter. Regulations didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in months, a pilot had been able to fight his plane, not his engine. That afternoon, the secret operation at RAF Kenley expanded. Sergeant Cooper and his ground crew, now working with Schilling's direct guidance, fitted restrictors into 4 more Hurricanes. The 5 modified planes flew combat patrols over the next 3 days. The results were immediate and undeniable: 0 engine failures. 12 separate times, pilots pushed their noses down to attack German fighters, and 12 times the Merlin engines roared without a single hesitation. The news spread not through official channels but through the informal, lightning-fast grapevine of pilots and ground crews. A squadron commander from Biggin Hill would land at Kenley to refuel, hear the excited chatter from Davies's pilots, and get on the phone to his own base. Within days, the story was all over southern England. The quiet engineer from Farnborough and her little brass washer had become a legend. Schilling's phone began to ring constantly. 14 calls in 2 days, all from desperate squadron commanders. Could she come to their station? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be made? The demand was overwhelming. She had only brought 6 of the devices with her. 6 handmade solutions to a problem affecting thousands of aircraft. The pilots didn't just want the modification, they began to demand it. Some seasoned veterans, men with dozens of kills to their name, started refusing to fly combat missions until their planes were fitted with the fix. This wasn't cowardice, it was common sense. They had lost too many friends to the Merlin's deadly cough. Their commanders, seeing the logic and the boost in morale, supported them. It was a quiet rebellion, a grassroots movement born of survival. This is when a curious bit of British humor entered the story. The engineers at Rolls-Royce, including the famed Sir Stanley Hooker, were astounded by the simple elegance of Schilling's solution. In the male-dominated, high-stress environment of wartime engineering, a nickname was coined. It was crude, slightly inappropriate, but it stuck. Miss Schilling's Orifice. The name spread even faster than the restrictor itself. Tilly, ever the pragmatist, didn't mind. She understood the dark humor that soldiers and airmen used to cope with constant danger. If the nickname helped them remember the fix and ask for it by name, she would accept it. It became a badge of honor, a symbol that your plane had been touched by her life-saving genius. The sheer volume of unofficial requests forced the Air Ministry's hand. They could have court-martialed Schilling for her flagrant breach of protocol. Instead, faced with undeniable results and overwhelming demand from their best pilots, they did the only sensible thing. They approved it. And they did it in just 4 days. Her proposal was fast-tracked, and her invention was officially labeled a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce was given the contract and began producing 500 restrictors per week. The floodgates were open. Schilling now found herself leading the charge. She assembled a small mobile team, loaded her trusty Norton motorcycle with tools and a supply of the newly manufactured restrictors, and began a tour of every fighter base in southern England. This image of her, a lone woman on a powerful motorcycle, roaring from one airbase to the next with the solution to their most deadly problem in her satchel, became an indelible part of her legend. She wasn't an administrator sitting behind a desk. She was on the front lines, personally supervising the installations, checking every single weld, ensuring that the fix was as reliable as the woman who invented it. The impact on air combat was immediate and is clearly visible in the cold, hard numbers of war. In March of 1941, before the restrictor, Fighter Command had lost 47 fighters in combat while shooting down 61 German planes, a kill-to-loss ratio of just 1.3 to 1, barely staying ahead. In April, after her device was widely installed, British losses dropped to 29, while German losses climbed to 94. The ratio had skyrocketed to 3.2 to 1. The tactical playing field had been completely redrawn. German pilots, who for months had confidently lured the British into dives, suddenly found that their greatest advantage had vanished overnight. RAF fighters were now more aggressive, more confident, and far more deadly. This whirlwind of events leaves us with an unresolved question about how innovation truly happens during a crisis. Official histories are often neat and tidy, describing problems, committees, and authorized solutions. But Schilling's story is messy. It's a tale of one person defying the system because the system was too slow. Was her act of maverick engineering a one-in-a-million exception? Or were there countless other unauthorized, undocumented fixes and improvements happening on tarmacs and in workshops across the country, implemented by sergeants and engineers who chose to save lives first and ask for permission later? The story of the restrictor may be the most famous, but it makes you wonder how many other unsolvable problems were quietly solved by someone who simply refused to wait. The brass restrictor solved the most immediate crisis, but Beatrice Schilling knew it was a stopgap. A brilliant one, but temporary. The proper engineering solution, the advanced pressure carburetor, would eventually arrive. But the war was a relentless engine of problems, and as soon as one fire was put out, another would flare up somewhere else. The fame of Miss Schilling's Orifice tends to cast a shadow over the rest of her remarkable career, but the truth is, her greatest contribution wasn't a single invention. It was her tireless ability to solve one impossible problem after another. While pilots over England were learning to trust their engines again, a new crisis was brewing in the frozen north. Britain had sent Spitfires to support their Soviet allies at the port of Murmansk in the Arctic Circle. But the legendary fighter plane, born for the temperate skies of Europe, was no match for the Russian winter. At temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, engine oil turned into thick, useless sludge. Fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died. The Spitfires were grounded, useless, while Soviet ground, crews, who had never seen a Merlin engine before, looked on helplessly. An urgent request landed on Schilling's desk. She didn't just send instructions, she immersed herself in the problem. Working in freezing test chambers, she replicated the Arctic conditions and developed a new cold start procedure. It involved using preheated oil and a precisely modified fuel mixture to coax the frozen engines back to life. Her solution worked. The Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk through the brutal winter of 1941, protecting vital supply convoys. Without her work, this critical aid to the Eastern Front might have been crippled. At the same time, the air war was climbing higher into the atmosphere. Late-war Spitfire variants were now flying at over 35,000 feet, nearly 7 miles up. At that altitude, the air is thin and starved of oxygen, and the Merlin engine struggled. The fuel mixture had to be perfect. Too rich, and the engine would flood and choke. Too lean, and it would overheat and seize. Schilling dove into the complexities of high-altitude performance, developing altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that gave pilots a vital 8% boost in power when they needed it most. In the thin air where a few extra horsepower could mean the difference between life and death, her work was, once again, saving lives. While she was solving these immense technical challenges, she was living with a profound personal anxiety. In 1938, she had married George Naylor, a fellow engineer who, at the outbreak of war, volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. He flew Lancaster bombers on 31 missions over the heart of Germany. Of all the branches of the British military, Bomber Command suffered the highest casualty rate. More than 1 in 2 crew members did not survive the war. Every time her husband flew, Beatrice lived with the terrifying odds. She, who spent her days making fighter planes safer, could do nothing to protect the man she loved in his bomber. They had an understanding. He never spoke of his missions, and she never spoke of her projects. It was a quiet, professional wall they built to cope with the unbearable stress. After the war, her work continued. She stayed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, tackling the new challenges of the jet age and the Cold War. She was a key engineer on the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile, working on its complex fuel delivery systems. She researched the dangerous effects of water on runways for braking jet aircraft, publishing papers that would make landing safer for a new generation of pilots. And then there's the bobsled. In one of the more unusual footnotes to her career, the Royal Air Force Olympic team asked her to help design their bobsled. It might seem strange, but the principles of bobsled design, aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management were all skills she had mastered. The team didn't win a medal, but thanks to her sound engineering, they didn't crash either. This incredible breadth of work, from Arctic warfare to ballistic missiles to Olympic sports, paints a picture of a brilliant and versatile mind. Yet, history has largely forgotten it. Her obituaries and memorials focus almost exclusively on the famous brass washer. This leaves us with a lingering question. Why has her legacy been so narrowly defined? Was it because the story of Miss Schilling's Orifice was so simple, so dramatic, and so perfectly captured the spirit of wartime ingenuity? Or does it reflect a deeper tendency in how we remember history, simplifying the complex careers of pioneers, especially women, down to a single, easily digestible anecdote? Beatrice Schilling was far more than the inventor of one clever device, but that one story has become the whole story. The singular focus on her famous restrictor, while understandable, simplifies the story of a woman who dedicated her entire life to engineering. Beatrice Schilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for 33 years, a career of continuous service that spanned the propeller age, the jet age, and the dawn of the space race. In 1948, her immense contributions to the war effort were officially recognized when King George VI appointed her an officer of the Order of the British Empire. She attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, accepted the medal, and, in a gesture that perfectly defined her character, she was back at her workbench the very next morning. The honor was appreciated, but the work was what mattered. Despite her undeniable genius and a list of achievements that rivaled any of her male colleagues, she never reached the top administrative positions. The director-level posts, the roles that came with public prestige and institutional power, were always reserved for men. The institutional barriers of the time were simply too high for even a mind like hers to overcome. By all accounts, Schilling accepted this limitation without protest. She seemed to prefer the hands-on work of the laboratory and the testing field, solving real problems with real solutions. But this quiet acceptance leaves us with a difficult question. Did she genuinely prefer to stay out of the boardroom? Or did she simply recognize an unwinnable battle and choose to focus her energy where it could make the most difference? We may never know if her contentment was a personal choice or a pragmatic surrender to a system that would only allow a woman to rise so high and no higher. She retired in 1969 at the age of 60, trading the challenges of supersonic flight and missile guidance for the familiar comfort of her own workshop. Her retirement was spent doing what she had loved since she was a girl, restoring vintage motorcycles. She still had the same Norton she had raced at Brooklands all those years ago, the very machine that had taught her the secrets of engines under stress. It was a tangible link to the intuition that had saved so many lives. Beatrice Schilling passed away in 1990 at the age of 81. Her legacy, however, refused to fade into silence. It lives on in quiet and sometimes quirky ways. In Farnborough, the town where she did her most important work, a local pub was renamed the Tilly Schilling, a cheerful public tribute to the town's quiet hero. Universities have named engineering buildings in her honor, and museums display her racing trophies and, of course, a few of the original life-saving brass washers. These small reminders ensure that the echo of her work continues to be heard. Her story is more than just a footnote in military history. It's a powerful example of how a different perspective, a fresh way of seeing an old problem, can lead to a breakthrough. While others saw a complex puzzle requiring a complex solution, she saw a simple imbalance that needed a simple correction. Her legacy isn't just the brass washer itself, it's the thinking behind it. It's a reminder that sometimes the most elegant solution is the one that has been overlooked in the search for a more complicated answer. When we look back at the giants of history, we often see generals, politicians, and world leaders. We see the people who made the grand decisions. But history is also shaped by quiet, brilliant minds in workshops and laboratories. People like Beatrice Schilling. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't command armies. She simply saw a problem and she solved it. She heard the deadly 1.5-second silence in the sky and dedicated herself to filling it with the roar of an engine that would bring its pilot home. Her story is a testament to the power of practical genius, of hands-on knowledge, and of the courage to defy convention when lives are on the line. She was a racer, an engineer, a pioneer, and a savior. The pilots who flew with Miss Schilling's Orifice in their engines may not have all known her name, but they knew that someone, somewhere, had given them a fighting chance. And in the end, that is a legacy more powerful than any medal or title. It is a legacy written not in history books, but in the countless lives that were saved and the families they came home to. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story left you thinking, we hope you'll join us again. Until next time, stay curious and be kind to yourself.